Thanks for the intro. Today I'll be sharing a bit about the way that God met me over spring break in Zion. But instead of sharing this elaborate story about some specific moment portraying God's presence, the reality is He really showed me that I don't necessarily need to know or understand what He is currently doing in my life. Rather, I simply need to show up ready for the adventure with Him and His people each and every day. And so in that week break off from school, God really met me with rest and just a time of reflection upon His goodness in this past year. So before I describe all the memories and adventures of spring break, I'd like to backtrack a little bit. To start off, this past August, I knew I needed a renewed spirit. I had come off a spring semester where I was probably the most distant from God I had been in my life. And reflecting back, I think my biggest goal of the year was simply to show up. And like all things, as being an engineering major, I like to have measurable goals. And so that meant physically showing up to church, fam, and huddle. But God provided much more than that. He expanded this idea of showing up to extend beyond the physical presence. It meant going to family each and every week out of that deep desire to be a part of the community, instead of this obligation or idea that I could go to family and become a better Christian. Showing up also meant vulnerability in my huddle and sharing in the good days, the hard days, the restful days, and the mere chaotic days. And so as I found myself in a week of rest and rejuvenation in Zion, I reflected back on this past fall of being a season of rest and renewal as well. The way my school schedule ended up happening, I had a lighter semester. And because of that, I found it easy to show up in the community, be filled by those around me, and fall back into the newness of life with God. However, to the contrary, this spring semester ended up being one of my busiest thus far, taking 19 credits of classes and 2 research labs, left very little room to have fun. Many weeks, Fridays seemed often in the distance, and I constantly found myself going from one task to the next, focusing solely on the next thing I had to do. And so that sense of adventure and joy and lightness and newness that comes with having God as your priority was not defining my walk. And so heading into spring break, I was ready for a week of rest. In the weeks leading up, God really echoed this idea of showing up with this kind of cliche phrase of, just tell me when and where to be, and I'll be there. The reality is I don't think I've ever fully embraced that before. Past me, I would have wanted to look at all the hikes, scout them out, and figure out which ones were my favorite before the trip. But instead of doing all of that work ahead of the trip and kind of planning it out, I took this trip as a way to truly show up ready for an adventure without needing to know a single specific. As I think through the moments about my adventure in Zion, the moments that stand out were the ones where we were gazing upon His creation and adventuring with His community. What connects the two is a simple idea of showing up and being present in the places He calls us to. In a place like Zion, it is easy to be reminded of His beauty and hand over everything. For me, each of the hikes showed God's hand in unique ways. For instance, the first hike we did was called Many Pools, and that just reminded me of the ways God surprises us and sees us beyond our expectations. Angel's Landing was one of the hikes that reminded me of His just viewpoint from above and how He sees over everything, as well as the vastness and wealth of His goodness. And lastly, the Narrows remind me of the more challenging seasons. I will be the first to tell you I fell 20 minutes into the Narrows with water all down my bibs, and yes, it was hypothermic conditions. But it was a reminder to look up and not become so fixated or frustrated on the little things. In these shorter hikes, like Many Pools or Emerald Pools, I guess, I saw God in each of us as we helped and encouraged one up the rocks as we climbed and ventured through them, as well as in the moments of silence when we all were just trying to soak up the awe of His creation. Similarly, God met me in community. Coming into this trip, I didn't know many people well, but the lighthearted joy and ease that came from hanging around people, whether that be on the hikes around camp, in our tent, or on the road was simply God reminding me of what it looks like when we all show up ready to dive into the newness of an adventure and a journey towards God. And so as we return back to normal rhythms this week, I hope we don't lose sight of what it means to be journeying with God, walking in the newness and adventures of each day. For me, this past week has meant returning to that first love and awe of wonder each morning. It has meant not overthinking and trying to make sense of what he's calling me to when I don't necessarily hear his voice in my quiet times, but continuing to show up. It has meant taking each day like an adventure and leaving space for God to move, the time for spontaneous walks, runs, lunches with friends, or late-night movies. We won't always know or understand what he is currently doing, but we can show up with an excitement for the journey and an adventure for what he is taking us on. I'm Mia, and that's my snapshot.